But our main speaker today, he was mainly a Kitty Hawks pilot who joined up in 1942. There was a big group of them, some of whom were members. Howard Wheatley was one in the same school. But then our speaker went to England for a year, and then he went out to the Middle East for 6 months and to Italy for 6 months, flying fighters. He flew about a dozen different sorts of fighters, mainly Kitty Hawks, but also he hastened to tell me that he'd flown the Mark 9 Spitfire, and that must have been quite an experience. So I'm going to ask our main speaker to come up today, and I want to introduce Col Morton.
It's very difficult to know until you come here what sort of a cross-section of people you're going to have that's interested in flying. But the people who support flyers are innumerable, as evidenced these days with the growth of familiarity, of the looks of anticipation on kids' face when they watch the Anzac Day parades. They are getting bigger, better and brighter, and the Air Force still occupies a very great part of them. So that today, what you saw from the resume that was in the invitation to this, I'd like to talk just quickly about what the Empire Air Training Scheme meant to all of us. Because irrespective of whether you served like we did in Europe or whether you flew in the islands, it influenced our lives, tremendous influence. And it was more evident probably in Europe because Stan Watt and Howard and all of us got our wings together. We've been fortunate enough in the last 60 odd years to keep in close touch. So the Empire Air Training Scheme was quite unique because in 1940 I also joined the Air Force before I was called up at the age of 16 and a half. They had a preliminary educational reserve. The whole point of the exercise was to bring people up to speed who lacked in some things. Now I lacked in something as the sort of friends I made in Fremantle Boys when I went there. We used to wagon and sit on the bloody wharf looking at the tugs and say, we're going to buy one of those when we're men and we're going to sail around the world. And one bloke, we used to call him Twit Walker, he always had 10 bob in his pocket, so no wonder we hung around with him. Also, I'd like to say that the Empire Air Training Scheme has not actually caught fire from the point of view of many people writing about it, but it's dealing with our trip to England and to serving with the RAF, who we were seconded to for 3 years of the 4 years that Stan and I were in it. On the airfield that we trained on was called Turn Hill. It still is a training space. Are you a Turn Hill man? Good. Well, a couple of years ago we had 12 trainees out from Turn Hill who got their wings at Pierce. And the Air Commodore, the Air Vice Marshal, flew out, and when we asked the question, he nearly fell over, and we all proceeded to get line shooting, which we could tell you a lot about. Anyway, the point is that the application of your learning came at a thing and in something that you actually lived for. Airways and air flying and all these things. In 1943 at Turn Hill, we had no less than 23 nations, I'm talking nations, of airmen flying training at Turn Hill. They also lacked the knowledge that we had who came from the Dominions, because do you know, for example, that it stretched probably begun in Canada, it certainly was in South Africa, it was certainly in Rhodesia, it was certainly in Australia and New Zealand. The Indian people had their own, and vaguely speaking, I don't know how many of the red dots that the old map that we all saw at school, the what was it, the Mercator's projection, wasn't it? Mercator's, that's right. And all the red dots, I suppose that's as many as there were training air crew, because the war of the Second World War from the European theatre was enormous. But that doesn't lessen the fact that if those people who'd stayed home hadn't helped themselves and been trained as airmen, we wouldn't have had it. But the spontaneity of it is that, as Brian told you, I actually flew 12 aircraft. And if Brian likes to go back and look, I put down the statistics because it is important. Why am I talking from where I'm talking? I finished up with a total of 634 hours and 50 minutes. I did 67 hours and 30 minutes on link training, because at the time when I was on tarmac duty in Geraldton, I found the link very intriguing, and I was served with, what's his name, Sergeant Perry, who ran it, and I got to the stage I could do a Maltese cross and close the ends. That's what it was about. Now, that was the sort of basis that the curriculum that becoming the Empire Training Scheme did for us all. And as you progressed and you got back discharged, it also influenced you because you remembered how to remember names, or some of you don't now. What did you leave behind? Because it was rote. I hear an argument going on this morning. Rote. Fancy having to learn the alphabet by rote. I wouldn't have known any other way to learn it though, would you?
No.
No, I mean, basically speaking, so the Empire Training Scheme, and it prepared the young men of those days to take up the business responsibilities of running a country called Australia and those countries, and we see many of them now taking high approach on. All those peoples who are being recognised by public for their expertise and their volunteering are to be, and don't tell me they don't recognise the fact that some of the organisation connected with a thing called the Empire Training Scheme wasn't an influence on it. It is, and it can always be. I drive a motor car listening to the engine. Do you? Well, you don't thrash your engine. You only get left what's called soup. So on one way or the other. So having said all that and introduced myself, I'd like to tell you that we actually spent a lot of time travelling. I was on 8 different ships, and it took us almost 3 months to get from Australia to England, and we had to go via America. When we were in England, we were there for about a year. We trained on a huge number of aircraft. So the question is now, do you want me to talk about the aircraft I flew and the variations? Or do you want to talk about the engines of the aircraft? Or do you want to talk about Italy? Or do you want to talk about Egypt? Because we had our toe in all those areas. And when we have a mix of people like this, I'd like to do the right thing by you. So while you're thinking about it, and if you would be kind enough to tell me what you'd like to know, I'll tell you some things here. This was out of X-Wing's Autumn Edition in 2000. Flying is the second greatest thrill known to mankind. Landing's the first. Takeoffs are optional. Landings are mandatory. If God had wanted man to fly, he'd have given him more money. Flying is not dangerous. Crashing's bloody dangerous. The only time when you have too much fuel is when you're on fire. A male pilot is a confused soul who talks about women when he's flying and about flying when he's with women. So, having had your respite, where shall I go from here? Because I'd like to tell you as much about my experiences in the short time, and also I'd like to take the opportunity of passing on a bit of something that I think is important. I've got with me the original photos of the course that I graduated with, and because so many of them are well-known people, I'm going to indulge the privilege of reading their names out. We're in 2 flights, A and B flight, and just next, Max Tilbrook, Meath Hammond, Gordon Freeth, Colin Bickford, Peter Groves, Arthur Anderson, Jack Hart, Brian Bale, Howard Wheatley, Jim Gibbard, Bruce Barrow, Jack Woods, Bill Dawson, Brian Burnell, T.B. Hart, Peter Davies, Laddie Duncan, Lyle Bell, Alan Black, Ted Gregory, Peter Brahm Gould, Johnny Gilbert, Harry Carrington, and I think Hall's name was Les. And the other group are Bob Cagey, Dave Hitchens, and Dave will be visiting Perth in March, and Stan are flying back to visit our squadron in April with him. Dave Hitchens, Pat Laidler, Arthur Marshall, Blue Leach, Pat Markham, who's Barry Markham's uncle, and Peter Markham's brother, Sid Rowe, Ian Hingle, Ron Smythe, Soda Davis, Butch Leary, Sam Saker, Dud Ibbotson, Shorty Jarvis, Straub McCoy, Wimpy Wainwright, Stan Watt, Ken Veal, myself, Sid Piercy, Shorty Herman, Wilf Allison, Tom Hurl, Archie Swan, and Col Morton. And the purpose of saying that is that we all graduated on the 22nd of December 1942. We were given our wings by Norman Brearley, because when we were called up, they put us back for a month, and we had to go in on the 1st of February 1942, having been called up for the end of December of 41. And I've got a list of here of names anyone wants to know. That's the whole course of ITS at Pierce, 101 of us, because they amalgamated the December and the January intake, which is why we finished up as 60 on our pilot course. And of the 60, I should say about 30 of us went via Australia, through America to England, and we served. And at Turnhill, they had about 400 airmen under training, and decided with the 1,000 bomber raids they were losing too many big air crews, and they took half the 400 pilots and put them into multis. Now the other side of the story is, can I tell you something else that you've not heard about Europe, because we did not hear much at all, if anything, about the islands. We didn't get much in the way of correspondence. We certainly got no mention in the newspapers. And I'd like to just use the time to answering questions, because a young man here, Barry Markham, who is Barry here today? I didn't see him. Well, Barry Markham we've had the pleasure of him piloting us around in his Tiger Smith, and he said to me, how do single engine pilots go solo? How do they do their first solo? And bring you stop to think of it, have you any idea of how we all went solo on such things as Spitfires and Kitty Hawks and Hurricanes and Mustangs? There you are. See, and that's exactly right, because the Empire Air Training Scheme put us together in such a fashion that you graduated. So from our point of view, we'll tell you we started in Tiger Moths. The next thing we went into Ansons. We graduated on Ansons, and while we were waiting to post overseas, we flew airspeed Oxford and did a beam approach course at Point Cook, which is a fantastic effort to help people down to land in bad circumstances with very little in the way of any idea of how to get you down. When we went to England, Stan and I went over and we flew Tiger Moths again. We were teaching air crew how to do a little bit of flying and how to do a bit of ground to air to ground map reading and things of that nature, and also to get a little bit of feeling of the English countryside. And then we went to Turnhill. We flew 3 different types of Miles Masters. The one was the Mark I, which was a Merlin Kestrel. The second one, Mark II. I've actually got all the dogs don't matter. I can go back and tell you about them. I'd better tell you their flying, their capacities and abilities, and their little, what's the word? Yes, that's right, because you've got to find those when you fly. Otherwise, if you don't know, you'll have the aircraft trying to fly you, and you instead of, it's like getting on a horse. You get a lousy temper, guess what? The horse has got a lousy temper. So we flew Mark IIs and Mark IIIs. When we went to Egypt, we first graduated, at least started flying, on Harvards. And the Harvards are a miniature Wirraway in a sense. They're a light training version where the Wirraway was built in heavier frame and it carried guns. Then we went to OTU in Abaswaya, and we flew Kitty Hawks, Mark 1s and 2s. And then we were posted to Italy. We did a refresher course at a place called Ancona, and we flew Kitty Hawks up to P40Ns, which down here you should have called them, did you call them N numbers or did you call them Mark numbers? Anyone who flew, there were 10. Was it N, George, was it? Yeah, because why I asked that, because we actually call them in the RAF markings 4As, and that was the first effort at putting a Kitty Hawk together with new controls, pitch control, fuel control, and also helping you recover outer systems. And then we were also asked to do a transfer over to Mustangs, so that the whole wing took those. So every squadron was given a couple of Mustangs. So we did our own conversion courses. And after doing our first tour of operations, Stan went off one way to join the army. His job was to talk dive bomber pilots onto their targets, and I went down and I did a flying instructor's course at Bala, and there we flew Hurricanes and Spitfires. Now, it's not line shooting, Anyone who's ever flown a Hurricane will tell you there's one thing we all wait for, to laugh our bloody heads off at. You get airborne, and you suddenly realise the air bottle is pumping up air and you're getting up to the red mark. And you think, God, what have I done? So I think that when you look around in your sector and you see all the pitch, fuel, grip, all the things, all the tests that you should do, didn't come to your mind, so you go back to Tower. And Tower laughed and said, just put your throttle, just put your selector lever into neutral and everything will be home. Because when you lift your undercut in a Hurricane, you actually have like the old 4-gear shifts in the old cars. And that's it, and you had to return it in the same, you controlled your flaps the same way, and it was done hydraulic, so you needed to keep your air bottle. What else we got here? The Italian campaign, if you would like, and I'm permitted to have a few minutes, just run over it. Those who have bought Stan's book here, Killer Hawk Pilots, there's a fair bit of time in it, and Stan was actually one of those who led a section. The whole of the wing was mounted on a thing called Operation Bowler, and the fact of the matter is it was the biggest air raid ever mounted in Italy. And why was Italy important to the Allies? Because Italy kept the Germans very occupied. In fact, when Italy capitulated, I've actually got it in writing, they took 1 million German prisoners of war. And wonder why? Because they could not get up the Bremer Pass. We had air supremacy, and we were pushing them back, and the last lines were fought in the area of Lombardy Plains. We were about the last of the big pushes there. And because the Australians were mainly Air Force, we were always kept pretty close together, and we mainly supported the English, the New Zealand, and the South African tribal. So you see that the Air Force and this training that we had was absolutely phenomenal. This still comes about the Empire Air Training Scheme giving you enough within its curriculum to actually answer any demands being made by the Air Force. But Stan's job was very, very interesting because they call it Rover. They never call it Rover Stan, did they? They call it Rover J. I'll come back to something which is quite unique because the Kitty Hawk was never invented to be a dive bomber. The Kitty Hawk had a prefix of P, which stands for P40, and P40 is a pursuit ship, and its use in 3 Squadron and 450 Squadron, our squadron in North Africa, was to be a fighter aircraft, and they did a very good job. In fact, there'd be very few aircraft could dive faster than them because they were wholly mounted over the wing. The body was not had the wings attached like you do in a Spitfire. It actually has the wings mounted over the whole body and they're joined in the centre. And there's a wonderful gun platform. It had 6.5 machine guns, and we carried up to 2,000 pounder bombs. And in Stan's case, he dropped 162,000 pounder bombs, and I dropped 152,000 pounder bombs in mine. So it proves about the average is around about 1,600 pounds we used to cover, which is not bad. But the most significant thing is you dive from about 8,000 feet. If you had a 1,000-pound cookie on, you got out a little bit higher, around about 1,500 feet, all of guesswork, so that you didn't blow your tail off. Or if you got a 500 package on board, you'd carry yourself down to 1,000 feet. So you gave yourself about a 500 feet margin for every pound weight you were dropping. And the whole idea is, for example, in this Operation Bowler, the Italians were so used to us dive bombing that they actually sat on the walls and watched it happening. And the army used to give us freedom of reign. They used to give us an area of 200 metres depth by 400 metres wide. They'd give you a coloured signal, and they'd allow you to be talked into by someone like Stan on the ground saying, we've got a gun cover here and it's covered this way, and giving you some sort of definite thing from a photographing. It was gridded, and the leader of our flight used to be read to and told how to make the best approaches and so forth. We were allowed to bomb within 200 metres of the front line. So it gives you an idea how damned accurate the aircraft became, and that's what we actually finished up doing, really dive bombing. And Italy itself was quite a phenomenal thing, but not given the publicity simply because the D-Day was being mooted. the morale of the Allies needed to be boosted, and Italy was a bit of a pain in the backside, but it held a lot of troops up. It also gave faith back to the Italian people, because for those of you who have ever fought over livable areas, such as bombing villages, and then a couple of days later going and asking to sell you their wine, to sell you their wine or their eggs or the ducks, is a bit of a kick in the bum. Where Tedeschi, which was what the German was known, he just simply took it. But basically speaking, Italy was an eye-opener as far as we were concerned, and there were 3,500 Australians in it. 500 of them were grave diggers. They came up from North Africa after having got all the war cemeteries cleaned up and rectified, and they came up, but most of us were airmen. And we had some of the biggest raids mounted that used places like Yazy and Foggia, where the Yanks sent their B-24s up to bomb the Ploesti oil fields. So they went in over the south of Russia. Hence the advantage of having a long-range fighter aircraft like a Mustang, which gave them support all the way. They could actually cover the whole distance. In fact, had a better loading and ability to fly and stay in the air than the poor devils did in the Liberators. The fact too that the Australians and South Africans and the New Zealanders, particularly the Maoris, had such an affinity was that the ship that I came home on was called the Dominion Monarch. 4,500 troops on us. When we sailed from the bottom of the canal and we headed for New Zealand, we sailed past Fremantle. We couldn't have quite hit it with a brick, but we could have had a Jerry Riddle on the bottom of Victoria. We finished up in Wellington on a Sunday, and they opened everything up, the pubs, the lot, and let us off and gave us a tremendous welcome. We finished up, drove their trams and their buses and whatever. They took us down to Littleton, then back to Sydney. So our trip from Egypt to get home to Fremantle was prolonged. But anyway, I've covered the waterworks. That's it. What a wonderful question. I didn't ask you to do that, did I? Well, let me tell you, some of the things that you had to worry about was, let's begin at Rome. Do you realise the marshalling yards alongside the Vatican City were a point of a very important target? So every air crew was, as far as they possibly could, made sure they had a Catholic member. As simple as that. But what else can you do? You all can help the hope. They'd give you all sorts of, in a briefing, they'd say you can't do this. In fact, now, get on the funny side of things, Fred. I'll come back to it if I may, but the next one to find was when they bombed the castle, the thing at Monte Cassino. Yeah, do you know how many times that was captured? 6. And guess who won it back all the time? The Air Force and the New Zealanders. And each time they were required to put that back into the hands of someone else, to let those experienced people out to go on to other targets, but backwards and forwards. So there really wasn't a brick on a brick. There's a state in Italy called the Papal State of San Marino, or San Remo. I'm not quite sure, it doesn't matter which way. Now, we were not permitted to go into that. I'm now talking from the ground troop point of view. You just weren't supposed to go in there. But the Germans wanted you to break those rules, so they put all sorts of provocative systems up to force you into doing it. Because the way to win a war is to drive a wedge into the front line and then come around behind them and then swoop them all together. Now that's what Stan was doing with us and these rover things. If they were held up with armed posts and machine gun nests, they'd bring us in to do the target over. And when we dropped our bombs, they said, all right, we give you 5 minutes strafing. Now that came down, and the big business of that was, how would you like to be running into 6.5 machine guns? They ran around there with their heads off like chooks. And it's a horrible thing to say, but it is war. And that's all there was to it. And of course, in no that melee, the army was then able to take that wedge and cut that slice out. So that's the only way they beat those areas. We came to another area called the beautiful bridge at in Florence, in Ponte Vecchio. The Ponte Vecchio is so old and so ancient, I wouldn't know. I think it has to be over 1,000 years, a history of over 1,000 years. And the centre part of the bridge, the whole of the bridge, is actually roofed, and it has all the lovely little souvenir shops, jewellery mainly, and all the gemstones and stuff like that. Now, in order to stop that being used, we'll come to the thing that I discovered, which upset me greatly. I visited and went into the crypts of some of the churches, because some of them are magnificent. You don't realise you're standing there amongst all the wonderful artists, not only the painting artists, but the architectural, the sculptors and all those sort of people. Now, the frank thing that I found was that the Germans had used those as their bomb dumps, and they had knocked holes in so they could put their beams and their bearers up, and they were going to mosaics. So that was it. And then they found that we might likely get into it, so they smashed the buildings down on both ends of the bridge. So they left the bridge standing, but that didn't stop them doing what they had to do. In fact, there was a nasty, what was the giggle I was going to say? And it did see in Venice was never really touched. That was one of the, yes, that's the thing we were being briefed to do the show on Venice about November of 1944, because the raid was done actually made on the 23rd of March 1945. And though it was a secret, and you thought it would have got out, I don't think it did. There were no leaks that we know of, Stan, were there? No leaks of the secret of bombing. The thing they wanted mostly was to prove that it was now being used as a way of servicing the German armies, because it's what they call an open port. You know, when the Monte Video, when they caught the battleship? Well, see, it made two Monte Video, I forget their names, but you know what I'm on about. Yeah, and that happened with the port. And you see, that people were supposed to be able to go there in an emergency, and the outcome of that was that the powers to be decided they wanted evidence to prove that. So they waited until they got sort of a little armada of German troop ships coming in. So they bombed the lot together, and that's exactly what did happen. And I just don't understand the way that we were told we could do anything we like, don't bring the bombs back. Now, I didn't do the raid, and you should really get Stan up one of these days again and get him to just talk about that only, and maybe we can get together and have a yarn, because it was absolutely fantastic what they did. The Italians sat on the roofs and watched it. That was the sort of thing you were putting up with. Half the battles were fought all on the Adriatic side, because that's slightly flatter. When you get into the spine of Italy, it starts to become very mountainous. You're dealing with lots of peaks that would probably get up around the 8 to 9, 10,000 feet in peaks, but you couldn't get tanks over those areas. So the west coast of Italy was very, very much untouched. In other words, Pisa, for example, was missed. In Florence, not in Florence, in Naples, when we landed, we were shipped to a place called Portici, and that was almost alongside Vesuvius, and it erupted. And I mean a real eruption, and the outcome of that was that alongside the building that we were occupying, a place the size of a tentacle was just dropped to subside about 50 or 60 feet of ground, just fell out of it. You're left with a hole. So Italy was really, and the torturous side of it was the Germans turned the water into the sewer, and the sewer into the water, and they had a grappling machine that pulled alongside behind a rail truck, and it knocked down all the electric overheads for electric trains, and every now and again it pulled the sleepers up, and then they had a party of men running along with rail grenades that they clipped to the top of the rail, so about every 20 feet they just chopped a hole in the rail. Oh boy, it wasn't a funny show. So we sympathised with what we heard about the islands, what we had going on, and I reckon about half of our course finished up at the islands, and about half finished up mainly on Maltese. That's where we lost our biggest ones, and that was it. In fact, if you'd like, I'll wrap up by just giving you the last statistics. We had about 250 pilots on the squadron, I do know the deaths. We lost 69 of them. Of the 250 odd pilots, only 69 of us, and Stan and I are 2 of them, ever finished the first tour of operations. We never came back because the arrangements with 3 Squadron, when they went overseas, they sailed on the Queen Mary the same as 450 Squadron.